Hello and welcome to Foreign Policy Focus. This is episode 204 and I am the show's host, Kyle. Joining me on today's show is Patrick MacFarlane. Pat, how are you doing today?
Real good, buddy. Real good to finally be on the Foreign Policy Focus with you.
Yeah, so everybody, Pat MacFarlane here is a great guy who just graduated from law school. He's the host of the Liberty Weekly podcast, and he covers a variety of subjects on that podcast, and I've been guest a few times discussing foreign policy, but he covers a lot of legal stuff. And so, he really flexes his expertise muscles there, and there's a lot of great content, especially you libertarians will love it. So his website is libertyweekly.net, and he has a pretty popular Facebook page or YouTube page, Liberty Weekly. And his work can also now be found at the libertarianinstitute.org and under the podcast section where you can find this show as well. So not only do me and Pat now cross over at the Libertarian Union, which is a group of podcasters that me and Pat are both part of. Find us on Facebook or libertarianunion.com. But we are also both podcasters now, for Scott Horton's Libertarian Institute. So Pat, welcome to the show.
Yeah, good to finally be on, man.
All right. So Pat, I brought you on today, legal analysis to discuss this trend, where you have, basically what it seems to me is FBI entrapments, which lead to, terrorism charges against mostly young Muslim men. And so the general trend of this, as far as I could tell, is that the FBI will use either paid informants or informants who are, informing to avoid their own charges, or they use undercover FBI agents. There's a database that's kept by the Intercept, and I'll link to that on the show notes page. But that database documents that there's been 859 people prosecuted for terrorism since 9/11. Of those, 559 have pleaded guilty. 184 have gone to trial. 3 have been found guilty at trial. 3 have been acquitted at trial, and 4 have had their charges dropped. Of those, there are still 365 in custody, with 60 awaiting a trial right now, and 310 of the 859 have been caught up in sting operations, and 100 in New York alone. So Pat, do you feel like there's any more characteristics of these trials that I'm really leaving out?
No, I think that just about covers it. What I really wanted to talk about was just the entrapment defense in general, and how it has emerged in response to more pre-crime, if you would like to call it, pre-crime operations by the U.S. government. And so two of the biggest things that I wanted to focus on today was, one, the entrapment defense, and 2, the issue of character evidence and how these two things relate together. Referring specifically to those statistics that you just presented, I will be referring to 2 different law review articles throughout this podcast. One is from Northwestern University. It's entitled Estimating the Prevalence of Entrapment in Post 9/11 Terrorism Cases. And this other one I'll get to is the other one is from Northwestern. This one is from the one I just read the title of is from a different university, but they'll be linked in the show notes page. But the problem really facing the study of entrapment cases is that there is no comprehensive policy analysis. And this one paper that I referred to, I read the title of, was published in 2015. And at that point in time, they are talking about the fact that there is no comprehensive database. So any big policy study that you're going to get is only going to focus on maybe 5 or 6 cases and not look at everything as a whole. So that's a problem that we are facing, is that policy experts are only looking at specific cases.
Right. And so when we think of entrapment, at least when I think of entrapment, I kind of go back to the movie Blow, starring Johnny Depp. At one point in the movie, there's this pot dealer that says to Johnny Depp's character, as he's about to sell him a massive bag of pot, "You're not a cop, are you? Because if you are, this is entrapment and you can't do it." Because Johnny Depp had approached that guy about, buying some weed to, distribute. And he says, "No, I'm not a cop." And they made the transaction, whatever. But in a lot of people's minds, they assume that that would be the case, that if you ask a cop an undercover officer, hey, are you an officer? Then they would have to tell you, and they couldn't be the ones that approach you to initiate a crime. So, for example, if somebody comes up to me and offers me $100 to go get them some weed, and I then take that money and go and get weed and bring it back, and that person then slaps handcuffs on me and says, aha, you are a drug dealer. And I say, well, this is entrapment because I never done anything wrong. I was just minding my own business. You asked for help. I thought I could make a couple bucks and I did it. So, Pat, is that the reality of how entrapment works? Because it definitely seems from reading these stories that none of these men were about to go commit a terrorist attack and were only prevented at the last minute by an undercover FBI informant.
Yeah, I'm not exactly positive about the whole, if you ask an undercover cop if they're a cop, they have to say yes. I should have checked into that before we started, but the reality of these cases are, well, let me just read you a quote from one of the biggest cases, right? That's United States v. Cromity. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, but here's the quote from the judge. The essence of what occurred here is that a government came upon a man both bigoted and suggestible, one who was incapable of committing an act of terrorism on his own, created acts of terrorism out of his fantasies of bravado and bigotry, the government did, and made those fantasies come true. Real terrorists would not have bothered themselves with a person who was so utterly inept. Only the government could have made a terrorist out of Mr. Cromity, a man whose buffoonery is positively Shakespearean in its scope. Here's another quote for you from a former FBI agent named Michael, either German or Germain. He says, prior to September 11, 2001, if an agent had suggested opening a terrorism case against someone who was not a member of a terrorist group, who had not attempted to acquire weapons, and who didn't have the means to obtain them, he would have been gently encouraged to look for a more serious threat. An agent who suggested giving such a person a Stinger missile or a car full of military-grade plastic explosives would have been sent to counseling, yet such techniques are now becoming commonplace in the FBI. So I know a lot of us have seen those memes around that says FBI foils FBI terror plot. However, as I think you mentioned earlier, often is the case is that the FBI will find people who are loners, losers in a lot of cases, people who have nothing going for them. They will induce them. They will propagandize them. They will provide them with weapons and money and drugs. And in some cases, they will tempt them with women in honeypot traps. And so that's more of what we're dealing with here.
And they do also seem to target, or at least it ends up being the people who maybe bites on their sting are those who are on the less intelligent side or maybe have mental illness or borderline mental illness. And, people who are tendencies to have, paranoia or to have loose, kind of connections with reality anyways. And these seem to be the people who end up buying into the terror plots. I mean, I read story after story and, you hear about how, the person, the target of the sting regularly can't make it to the meetings on time, isn't able to arrange a babysitter for their children, doesn't have 20 butts on them to buy the, most basic of, bomb making supplies, quote unquote, at the local hardware store. And so it's hard to, imagine that, left to their own devices, these people would be the next Osama bin Laden.
Yeah, and in many cases, they actually have to be badgered persistently in order to participate in these terrorist events. And I'm specifically referring to, there was a left-wing, so this isn't a jihadi case, but it was a left-wing case of eco-terrorism, where there was a woman who came upon a group of losers, basically basement-dwelling people, and she persistently badgered them until they undertook a terrorist act, like calling them wussies and over again over a period of months. So that's what we're talking about here.
And I've also noticed a trend that there's, more than one person involved. So sometimes it's like an informant and an undercover agent or multiple informants. And so that to somebody who doesn't have many friends and then suddenly they're able to attract a couple of friends, or to have somebody kind of, if you're on the fence about something and to go to another person with it who you think you could trust and say, hey, this other person is telling me this, and they say, oh yeah, you should do that, then that obviously just seems to be even more of a trap and unfair.
Yeah. And, the courts have really struggled with this too. And I've, for this episode, I've done a lot of looking into how the courts have dealt with the entrapment defense. The case.
Yeah, so I guess, the question here that I should be asking you is, what happens when these guys go to court and they say, look, I wasn't going to do anything. This guy approached me. He said, hey, buy this phone card and I'll send it to ISIS so they can release their propaganda. And, I did it because I was helping out a friend, or I was shown, footage from American war crimes over and over again and end up doing it. So, well, how does that go over for these guys?
Not well. And, as you would think, to date, legal claims of entrapment, I'm quoting here, have not prevailed in a single post 9/11 terrorism prosecution. And in fact, the entrapment defense is not well received at all. And I believe in Wisconsin, you can't even assert an entrapment defense. And, that has to do with, in Wisconsin state law, you can't even assert an entrapment defense. And that just has to do with, what I really wanted to get into, which is the history of entrapment and how it fails to comport with traditional legal criminal law. So, should I go into that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think this is what's really important here.
Okay, so stop me at any point if you want me to explain something better, because there might be some legalese involved.
Right.
So in federal courts, I'm going to quote here, the difficulty in successfully asserting the entrapment defense, both in terrorism cases and more, quote, basic criminal procedures. The trouble stems from the unique contours of the doctrine itself. Under the subjective test employed in the federal courts and in the majority of states, entrapment excuses criminal liability where two key conditions are satisfied. So you need two elements. A defendant has to show, one, that the government agents induced the charge offense, and two, that the defendant is not otherwise predisposed to commit the crime. So I'll say that again. The first element is the defendant has to show that government agents induced the charged offense, and two, that the defendant is not otherwise predisposed to commit the crime.
So basically what you're saying is it has to be a case where the guy wasn't already an ISIS member, and then the government agent said, hey, would you like to do this? Because in that case, the guy was already predisposed to commit the crime. And likewise, it has to be a case where the government agent suggests the crime. It can't just be that the government agent is showing the guy propaganda video after propaganda video, and then the guy says, boy, we should go blow up a building, and then he tries to carry out that act.
Well, the problem with that is that under the modern law, the predisposition element has come to dominate the entire entrapment dilemma. So the first element becomes largely irrelevant. That's just the way that the cases have gone. So factors like the nature or size of the inducement, the complexity of the government artifice, or the independent capacity of the defendant to commit the crime are largely irrelevant. Rather, the only important thing is whether the defendant is a person otherwise innocent, rather than one prone to criminality. So there's a huge problem with this. And the problem is that in traditional criminal law, we don't like subjective tests. So there's what's called the rules of evidence. So when you are having a trial, the court has certain rules for evidence to make sure that the evidence is trustworthy and not unfair. So the biggest issue here is that under this defense, we are getting into judging the defendant based on his prior bad acts. And that's a big no-no in evidence, is that so if you can't use character evidence to show that someone is predisposed to commit a crime. So let's say that, Kyle, I walk up to you and I punch you in the face, right? And you're suing me for battery. So you're saying, you caused me bodily harm. You shouldn't have. It was unjustified. Well, at trial, you cannot bring in evidence that I punched people in the face before, because that's unfair. Because the jury would then say, well, he punched people in the face before. He probably punched people in the face this time. Well, under the rules of evidence, that is inadmissible because it's unfair. it's unfairly prejudicial to me, and it's irrelevant because just because I punched someone in the past doesn't mean that, I punched you this time. Is that all clear enough? So
yeah, that's really good.
Okay. And so the problem, and so we're wondering, okay, where did this entrapment defense come from? Right? It didn't come from the common law. The common law would be the traditional law, the traditional rules that is bubbled up from the courts over a series of decisions. It doesn't come from a legislature. The common law doesn't. So this comes from a doctrine or a school of legal thought called positivism. It's the idea that law is only man-made. Law has no connection to morals. It has no connection to the common law per se. That law is a creation of humans. That's what legal positivism asserts. And so you have these two conflicting schools of thought. And the classical criminal tradition in the Western sphere and the American sphere comes from England. And so under the common law, traditionally the common law, the traditional approach to criminal law, it lacked empirical foundations. And this came from antiquity, from the Anglo-Saxon legal tradition. The criminal law lacked empirical foundations, so it was more of a philosophical approach, focusing on the content and function of the criminal law. It viewed the offender as a rational actor with free will who was responsible for particular acts of wrongdoing. And this should sound familiar, Kyle, as Misesian human action. Misesian human action would be Ludwig von Mises, his insight in economics, just viewing people as rational human beings that act with purpose, as opposed to a scientific study, which is what the legal positivists would assert. So the strain of legal positivism that came in under the criminal law system originated in the late 1800s in Italy. And this was a scientific empirical movement that focused on the origins of crime and the study of criminals themselves, not on philosophical questions. This is where the roots of our modern criminology come from, is this legal positivism that came from 1800s Italy. It was the scientific empirical study of criminals themselves in opposition to philosophical questions like the traditional law. And it found huge reception in the United States in the progressive era. And it has shaped a lot of the foundations of where our modern law comes from. So some aspects of positive law that you might recognize is the death penalty, pre-trial detention. So that is, putting people in prison while they await trial. And, I think that violates due process myself because you haven't really adjudicated anything, or deemed guilt. It also includes civil commitments, for sex offenders. That's, something from positive law. And it had a renewed interest in rehabilitation. So we can see the positive law influence in our modern court system through things like judging offenders based on a algorithm. So like in bail sheets. So if you get arrested, they determine your bail based on a bail score in some counties where they'll say, oh, how many times has he skipped out on bail? Well, we'll assign a number to that. Does he live in the area? Well, we'll assign a number to that. And then we'll add up all the numbers and divide them. And that score determines whether or not we let him out on parole. So it's very scientific. So obviously the positivist era, not all positivists coming over from Italy believed the same thing, but all of them believed that we needed to reorient legal thinking from philosophical debate about the nature of crime to an analysis of the characteristics of the criminal themselves. So that's what they all believed, as opposed to the classical belief that the only difference between the criminal and non-criminal is a contingent event. One has chosen on occasion to behave in a criminal fashion, while the other has not. This difference of conduct reveals nothing beyond itself. The individual in each case is assumed to be similarly constituted as a free, rational human subject. Okay, so this really led the courts to tailor their penal judgments not to the crime itself or to the moral culpability of the accused, but to a scientific appraisal of the criminal's character. And this positivist process had three steps. One was differentiation, which is organizing criminal offenders by criminal types. So you see this empirical putting people into categories as opposed to judging the specific incidents. So when you get into sentencing, this would be the judge looking into the criminal's past and maybe adding a more severe punishment based on the previous things that they've committed, right? And I think it's a little technocratic, judging people for their past events and not for the event currently in front of you. The second step, aside from differentiation, was pathology, which was establishing a scientific hierarchy of these character types. And this is where the positivists descended into eugenics. And we can see the positivists and the progressive era being very intertwined in these eugenic ideas. So the early positivists were eugenicists that didn't like, the classes that they didn't like, whether it was an ethnic group they didn't like, people with tattoos, they were eugenicists. And the third part of the positivist law is interventionism. And this is where everything comes full circle. So interventionism was essentially pre-crime. And so when we see positivists come into America during the progressive era, it all comes full circle where they influence, where the American administrative state is coming into being with the progressive era. And so now the positivists start producing sting operations. And so this is where it comes full circle to the entrapment doctrine, is this positivist idea of interventionism, the death penalty, doing sting operations, entrapping people. And this presented a real problem for the courts because under the traditional common law system, they had no defense. They knew that entrapment was wrong and that these sting operations, that there was something not quite right about them. But under the original interpretation of the law, they didn't know what to do about it under the common law. So is everything making sense so far?
Yeah, no. Great job.
Okay. And so the federal courts really start, it started with state court where the common law tried to deal with an entrapment case and they didn't really know what to do with it. They knew that they had to acquit the person that was entrapped. And in fact, the judge in the case refers to the original entrapment as being Adam and Eve, where the serpent tempts Eve into biting into the apple. And the common law courts don't like the entrapment defense because they said, well, we have the mens rea and we have the actus reus. Those are the two components of any criminal offense. The mens rea is the mental state required, the intent to do wrong, and the actus reus is the act itself. So they took a look at this and they said, well, it's just like Adam and Eve. Eve had the intent to do something wrong. She knew biting the apple was wrong and she bit it anyways. That's criminal culpability right there. And so the first case was in Texas. It was called Bacchus, and I don't have the full site on me. But it was a private investigator who induced, so a bunch of banks in this town found out that there was going to be someone that came to rob banks or someone that was plotting to rob banks. So they induced this group to rob the bank, and they did everything, including like they had an agent that went and opened the back door of the bank. And then when they got in the bank, all the sheriffs were there and they were like, ha, gotcha. And so the common law court didn't like this. But then we have the federal court starting to deal with it. And they're really struggling with this because they realize that, so the common law kind of develops where they give a certain out. In a crime where there's a victim, there's certain elements. In a crime that has a victim, it is the lack of consent is one element. And they found that consent could be inferred if the victim induced the crime. So they would find that one element of the criminal offense was not met if the victim induced the crime. While what you have with entrapment cases is that there is no victim because the government has manufactured this crime called terrorism. Unless there was an act that was like, blow up the bank, unless it's like an explosive criminal act, then there are victims. But in this case, the government is creating the crime itself. Whereas if we referred earlier to gift cards, sending a gift card to someone isn't illegal. There's no victim there. The government created this crime. So under the common law, the entrapment defense makes sense. But statutorily, in terrorism cases, it doesn't make sense. That's because there is no victim here. And so, yeah.
Because who would be the victim in a case where the FBI like invents a terror plot, right? They say, hey, we're going to go shoot up this mall on this day. But then as soon as the guy goes to buy the first gun that doesn't have a firing pin in it anyways, is there really a victim? Because I mean, he, doesn't have any ability to carry out that act. He isn't being sold weapons too. Just kind of interesting.
Yeah. And so I guess what I'm trying to get at is that there's a difference between the common law here. Traditionally, entrapments don't make sense. That's why the courts are so adverse to it. It doesn't make sense traditionally because the government is not supposed to be inventing victimless crimes. And so when the government invents victimless crimes and when they create these pre-crime offenses, the courts don't know what to do with it because it doesn't make sense. And that's why we have so many terrorists that are unsuccessfully presenting the entrapment defense, because legally speaking, what the government is doing doesn't make sense.
I guess, Pat, what I wanted to kind of go from here is just to know, in your opinion, is what the FBI doing is it entrapment? I mean, is there really a victim here? Would these, is there really even motive? How do you view it from, your interpretation of, common law and everything else?
I don't like the entrapment defense. I don't think that it really has a place in common law unless there's a victim. Like I said, with the common law elements, under the common law, when there's any crime, you have to prove, the actus reus and the mens rea. And then there's the elements of whatever offense that you are being charged with too. And with the common law, when there's a victim, that one element is missing, so people can't be charged. That makes sense to me. Statutorily, it doesn't make sense. And that's why the federal government, the FBI, they shouldn't be participating in this. But I do think that the people they induce, they are committing a criminal act with the requisite mens rea and the actus reus. So I think it is crimes. I do think that these people who are being induced are committing crimes. However, the FBI shouldn't be doing this. So I think it is right that these people are being charged and committed or convicted, even though it's unfair. They should have known better, I think, but that doesn't absolve the FBI of guilt, of blameworthiness here.
All right. Very interesting take, Pat. The kind of other thing I want to go over is, are there other injustices that the FBI is carrying out in these crimes? Forget the kind of entrapment angle at this point, but is giving if somebody can't come up with the money needed to carry out the terror plot and then they give them the money and then they're able to carry it out, what are kind of the common law tactics that the FBI should be using here?
Well, I'm in my bar study right now, so I should know this. We didn't do criminal law yet. But I would say it's probably conspiracy. The FBI should not be above, the laws that everyone else has to abide by. So if FBI agents participate in a conspiracy to commit a terrorist act, they should be charged as terrorists too. So yeah, that would be my answer. I'm sure that in certain instances what if they put someone in every position to commit a terrorist offense, and because of a mistake by the FBI, the person actually ends up blowing up a school, or something like that. I think that's a risk. I don't know. I'm not exactly familiar with everything the FBI is doing, but I'm sure they've been in situations where they've, set someone up. All they had to do was pull the trigger, and then the FBI screws up and doesn't stop them in time,
I think this is a fantastic solution. Just charge the FBI, the undercover FBI agents and informants with the same crimes you charge the alleged terrorists with. That seems like it would solve this problem really quickly.
Yeah, well, what's happening in the meantime while the FBI is screwing around trying to create terrorism? And it's not like there has been major terrorist events since 9/11. There have been some, but again, you see the FBI's fingerprints all over it, with Omar Mateen. And I know Mance Raider has done some work on the Pulse nightclub shooting, but this is a very similar situation where it turned out after the fact that Omar Mateen's dad was actually an FBI informant.
Right.
Yeah.
Or, I mean, I look at other cases where the Boston bombers were interviewed and warned by the Russian government, about those guys, but they were interviewed by the FBI. There were countless warnings about the Parkland shooter, the guy who shot up the place in Tennessee. Oh, and I bet to where I was thinking about before, when you talk about an undercover agent getting duped by an actual terrorist and the terrorist actually carrying out the bombing plot. I mean, look no further than OKC, because there were an awful lot of FBI undercover agents and informants surrounding Timothy McVeigh leading up to that attack.
Yeah, I have heard about that.
And I'll link to an episode of the Scott Horton show or one of Scott Horton's interviews. I think he did a pretty good one with Mance Raider. Free Man Beyond the Wall podcast also can be found at libertarianinstitute.org. And the pretty good interview covering how the FBI angle behind that shooting as well. Now, I noticed another kind of trend through all these cases, Pat, and that is there's a lot of plea deals. In fact, you had 559 of the 859 just pleaded guilty and said, I'm not even going to try to defend myself. So, what's your take on plea deals? And I know this is a general trend in the war on drugs and other things as well.
Well, plea deals are complicated. This is just my initial thoughts. I haven't really had a whole bunch of time to think about this, but as an attorney, you have a professional responsibility not to plead your defendant out unless they actually did it. And this comes, I was a PD in Ramsey County in Minnesota here, and a lot of people are in really hard situations because, if they don't take the plea deal, then the prosecution is going to up the charges the next time. Or they're either going to up the charges or not dismiss something. And if, let's say you're on probation or something, or you have a suspended sentence, and you can't be charged with another criminal offense or something like that, you might have to take the plea deal. If they offer a petty misdemeanor, which isn't a criminal offense, and you're being charged with the misdemeanor, they offer a petty misdemeanor, and you have a suspended sentence, you might want to take that petty misdemeanor to avoid getting struck on your suspended sentence, even though you didn't commit the offense, the underlying offense. So there's just lots of situations where you might want to take the lesser offense to avoid a really bad result for yourself, even though you didn't actually do it. And this is probably the case with all these terrorism suspects, is that, they didn't actually do the crime, but they're going to take the plea deal anyways, because if they don't, the results are horrible. Right.
Well, you do hear these stories about people who are facing, count after count after count. Michael Flynn being, a great example of somebody who was entrapped by another way, by the FBI, where basically they asked him a question that they already knew the answer to. And when he gave a slightly different answer, they slapped some line to the FBI charges on him. So I don't know how much entrapment is, but it certainly seems like he was, set up and trapped by the FBI on that. But where he's facing all these charges and then he agrees to plead to something where he doesn't get jail time, that he cooperates with the FBI, and, they make these bargains and stuff. I don't know, it just seems to be turning, the justice system into like a flea market or something like that.
Yeah, and this is the problem that I keep referring to when I'm comparing the common law to the statutory law, because I prefer the common law. It comes organically, it bubbles up, it's bottom up, whereas statutorily it's top down. And what you said, the common law elements, they require certain things. Well, statutorily, it's not, it's based on dictation, so they can say whatever they want. They can get rid of the mens rea for a crime. They can get rid of the mental state required to charge you with the crime just by their own dictates. Whereas in the common law, you would need, like I said before, you need mens rea and you need an actus reus. Well, statutorily, they can just get rid of the mens rea so they can charge you with the crime even if you didn't have the requisite mental state. That's like a seatbelt violation. You didn't intend to not wear your seatbelt, but they saw you not wearing it anyways. So statutorily, doesn't matter. We're still going to charge you with the crime.
I love your, detailed take on the common law and everything, Pat. I think that's been really enlightening to understand how these cases end up working. The underlying problem here seems to be the way, not just the laws, but the way the law is enforced, where, as you've alluded to a few times, this does seem to be something of pre-crime, where, when I bring this up to a lot of people, kind of the response they give me is, well, it's good that the FBI is doing this because it's like they're fishing, and the bait they lay down is bait that only terrorists will pick up. And so basically what they're doing is they're getting all the potential terrorists out of the pool. And I don't know, Pat, if you have any opinions on that.
Yeah, I don't think that the FBI, I think that's debatable, because in a lot of these situations you have people who are not able, absent the FBI's involvement, these people are not able to even come close to committing a terrorist act. So we're wasting our time here. If we set it up too well, these people might actually commit terrorism. And if we don't, then these people would never have committed a terrorist act in the first place. So it's a lose-lose situation. And I just wanted to highlight, I think the biggest problem with this is, where is the law coming from? Where is it coming from? Is it coming bottom up from the people, or is it being dictated from the top? And when it's being dictated from the top, I just wanted to connect that with its progressive era roots in eugenics as well, because that is such a big part of this. And you have the entire United States changing so much at the beginning of the 1900s and accepting this idea of legal positivism top down. And it's so intertwined with eugenics. And a lot of the problems we're seeing in the modern criminal justice system, I think, can be traced back to that top down process.
Well, I think the most important thing here, and this is one of the reasons why I'm a libertarian, isn't that, all the, progressive era law is bad. Just because it's top down doesn't mean that people aren't passing decent laws that wouldn't be enforced culturally anyways. However, the problem is that some of the laws that come from the top down are absolutely terrible. And you have all these absolutely terrible and awful policies. And then you have an event like 9/11 happen. You have people in power like Dick Cheney and George Bush and John Bolton. And they do everything they can to exploit it to the maximum possible level, to take as much freedom as possible. And there's no fundamental underlying principle in the culture that says, no, we don't do things this way. That, says that, we can't start entrapping people. Our FBI agents aren't going to sit there, spend all day online showing propaganda videos of real U.S. war crimes happening in Afghanistan and Yemen and Somalia. And they're not going to sit there and talk to the people saying, hey, did you know the U.S. is starving 8 million people to death in Yemen right now? Yeah, that's a real problem. Doesn't that make you hate the U.S. a lot? And then, they build and they build and they build. And sometimes they have to threaten these people, but they're able to get them to commit crimes. And if you have that fundamental, as you say, the bubble up system where the laws come, principle and based on rights, then you don't have this kind of problem.
Yeah, and because there's built-in safeguards when it bubbles from the bottom up. There's no one hand that is creating the law and directing it. And I think that's really important.
Right. Well, did you have anything else you want to add on this, Pat? Or, I don't know, it does seem like there's an awful lot of cases here. I mean, I know it's been 17 years coming on now since 9/11, but 859, I mean, if you're just somebody who watches Fox News, right? And then every time one of these prosecutions happens, you see a little breaking news banner, FBI foils another terrorism plot. That seems pretty significant.
Yeah, and it does, unless you know any better. I think that this really just goes to show that terrorism is just another boogeyman. I mean, just straight down to it. It is manufactured. I think we would have maybe less than 1/100th, maybe 1/1000th of the terrorism if the FBI just didn't exist, or if we weren't fighting wars of aggression abroad. It would be so minuscule, because we can trace the common thread of all these terrorist events, and the federal government's fingerprints are all over it at a lot of, and demonstrably so, documentedly so. Just one final note on the common law is that the purpose of the common law is to enshrine the customs of what people are doing to resolve their disputes anyways. the courts are supposed to enshrine that custom and build it into law, and capture what people are doing anyways. And, if it's statutory, then the purpose of the statute is to codify what people are doing anyways. So.
All right. Thanks, Pat. And I think, you kind of linked it there. Really important at the end is why I talk about this on Foreign Policy Focus. If you look, you have the war, and then that creates a situation where FBI agents you have the war, blowback 9/11. Now you got FBI agents running around and trapping people. Then you have the situation where, all the people see the Fox News banners that more terrorists were created. And so that means they're all going to go out and support more wars to go up and blow up more people overseas. That, gives people, in the Middle East or in the U.S. a reason to hate America, and we end up with more blowback. And so, this is just one of the links in, the many chains that turn the, wheels of government and the war machine of the United States.
Yes, and I'll end with this, is the war is not meant to be won. The war is meant to be continuous. And terrorism is the mechanism, the boogeyman of terrorism, or any boogeymen are the mechanism that drives that continuous war.
All right. Thank you so much for coming on today's show, Pat. Again, Patrick MacFarlane, recent graduate of law school. Liberty Weekly is the podcast, libertyweekly.net. You'll find his podcast at libertarianinstitute.org. Pat, is there anywhere else you would like to send people?
Just to underline the fact that you, Kyle, do appear on my show, the Liberty Weekly podcast. We do video versions, so Kyle gets to show us with his pointer exactly what he's talking about on the maps and stuff. So there's a bunch of shows featuring Kyle at libertyweekly.net. Just go there and search Kyle Anzalone.
All right. And you can find this show at foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com or libertarianinstitute.org. The news website is immersionnews.com. I also want to send everybody to the Sherry Voluntary show. She just had me on as a guest. I talked about Israel-Palestine. I was actually pretty happy with how I did on that podcast, so I really suggest all of you go and check that out, and I'll link to the episode on the show notes page.